It gives me great pleasure to introduce Natasha. Natasha was with us yesterday and gave 2 talks, one to the F block on social media and self-esteem, which was, I do ask them about that, looking at kind of feeds and addiction and how to try to prevent that, but actually thinking about what you put into your brain and how that affects the way that you see yourself and things. And then the E block, a talk on body image and self-esteem. So I'm delighted that she's come to speak to you guys. It's the first time I've managed to get her to come to talk to parents. Not her fault, but to come to talk to parents. I'm sure she'll welcome questions at the end. Are you going to give a little bit of information about yourself? Yeah, perfect. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I hope that you'll leave here with some new information and some challenges to some of the things that you might think you know about body image and mental health and physical health. What I'm showing you today is not a carbon copy of what I did for the E-block yesterday. It's adapted for adults, but the themes are identical. So apologies if you know any of this stuff already, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to give you exactly the same messages so that you can be reinforcing them at home, what they've learned at school. But before we get onto that, I'll tell you a little bit about me. My job involves going into about 3 schools a week on average, mainly here in the UK, but sometimes I get invited to other schools throughout the world as well. And when I'm in there, I deliver talks, but I also do focus groups with 13 to 18-year-olds. And the aim of those groups is to find out, when they reflect on their PSHE lessons, what was missing? What would they like a lesson on? What could have maybe been taught differently that would have been helpful for them? And based on the feedback that they give me, I then work with a team of neuroscientists, psychologists, and psychiatrists to come up with lesson plans, which I then take back into schools. And I hadn't been doing this job very long before I realized that there is this link between mental health and social justice. When I first started doing this job, which was back in 2008, I was sublimely apolitical, believe it or not, anyone who is familiar with my work. And as I was traveling around the country and I was talking to young people and parents and teachers, I started to notice these patterns, and then I started to research it. And what I realized was the way that we're taught about mental health is only giving us a corner of the picture, really, because we're always taught that it has to do with individuals and their brains and their family and their trauma, and that recovery is about fixing the individual's brain through therapy or medication or whatever that might look like. But when you zoom out and you look at the patterns in the way that mental health issues manifest, you notice very, very distinct patterns. So, for example, racialized people, non-white people, are more likely to experience a severe mental health issue, less likely to see a positive outcome from treatment. LGBTQ+ people, 4 times more likely to self-harm. Men are more likely to need to seek help for addiction. Women are more likely to need to seek help for depression. They're also more likely to be diagnosed with depression. And this is always presented as good news for women. The traditional headline is always, oh, women are more likely to, you're very welcome to me, miss nothing, it's fine. Women are more likely to receive a diagnosis for depression. This is because it's easier for women to talk about their mental health and therefore easier for them to access the support they need. That, again, is only part of the story, because when you look at women's health outcomes more generally, women are very often diagnosed with depression when the reasons that they went to their doctor were either hormonal or even when they're in physical pain. And the reason for that is it was only 2022, so very, very recently, when it became compulsory for GPs to learn about female anatomy. There's so little known about women's bodies, which is why when you go to your doctor and you have an atypical issue, your doctor says, I don't know what's wrong with you, maybe you're a witch. And every woman in this room has had that experience. So it's not great news for women in the way that it's often presented. There's also this link with poverty. Poverty is the number one contributory factor to all health issues, whether mental or physical. The bottom 20% income bracket here in the UK are 3 times more likely to develop mental illness across the board. There is also a link with neurodiversity and physical disability. So what these types of statistics tell us is that it's not all about the individual and the individual's family and their brain. It's to do with society and the way that different people experience that society depending on their identity. So that's what led me into campaigning and trying to make the world a little bit fairer. I was very briefly the government's first ever mental health czar in 2015. Was fired in 2016 for being too outspoken about austerity and education policy. So it didn't end well. But I continue, I move. And I also have a weekly show on LBC on Saturday evenings, which is sometimes called the woke hour, which I find horribly offensive because it's 2 hours and people should know that. This is how I see mental health, okay? I see it in 3 columns. It used to be, about 10 years ago, I would say, that when we were discussing mental health, we would only ever focus on the right-hand column. These are diagnosable mental illnesses. And there was this statistic that everybody knew, which was 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health issue. That's actually not quite right. It's during any given year, 1 in 4 of us is currently experiencing a mental health issue that is diagnosable. That doesn't mean that a quarter of us have been diagnosed. It means that a quarter of us are experiencing something that a doctor or another expert could diagnose. We very much confined it to the right-hand column. Over the past decade, the conversation has swung over to the left, and now we are all about the wellness, and we acknowledge that everybody's got a brain, and that's a good thing, I think. I do think the conversation has been co-opted slightly by people who are trying to sell, vegan candles on Instagram, but nonetheless, I'm glad that it's happening because what it's done is it's universalized the mental health conversation. Where my work is situated is right in the middle. These are issues which can affect your mental health, they can affect your ability to perform, they can affect your behavior, your quality of life, but they are not diagnosable mental illnesses. And I tend to find when it comes to these middle column issues, people have 2 very unhelpful responses. They either pathologize them, they either talk about them as though they are mental illnesses, which they are not. They can be symptoms of mental illness, but they're not mental illnesses in their own right. Or they go completely the other way, and they say, young people need to be more resilient. If I hear that one more time. Resilience is a byproduct of being supported in the right way. And by that, I don't mean all the support in the world. What I mean is children need to be held like a bar of soap. If you squeeze it too hard, they slip out of your hands. If you drop them entirely, they slip out of your hands. So it's giving them just the right amount and just the right type of support. And people who are supported in that way are resilient. I also think that people don't take context into account a lot of the time. So every year I see this. It's weird having 1 foot in education and 1 foot in media because you see the disconnect between what's actually happening in schools and how it's reported. And every year, charities like ChildNet will report greater numbers of children and young people using their services because they're experiencing exam stress that is intolerable to them. And every year, they get a columnist, usually from something like the Telegraph or the Mail, out onto the TV to talk about how exams are not any harder than they were. In fact, they're easier. And therefore, this is proof of their theory that young people are snowflakes who need to toughen up. And then normally they start talking about bringing back national service. And that whole conversation misses something really fundamental, which is this. It's not about the exam. It was never about the exam. The hardness or easiness of the exam is not the point. It's about what the exams represent. When I went to school in the 90s, we had room to fail. We knew that it wasn't the end of the world if we made a mistake. We knew that there were other options available to us. We knew that we could go to university and not leave with record amounts of debt. We knew that we weren't entering into this hugely competitive job market. We even thought that we might own a house by the time we were 30. I mean, we were fools, but we thought that that might be an option for us. The world has changed, and there is so little wiggle room now for young people to make a mistake. And this is not helped by social media, where everything they do is documented and creates an indelible footprint on the internet. And that's why exams are so scary for them. a lot of the issues, a lot of the conversations that we're having about these issues, I think, are hugely reductive, because reductive conversations are entertaining, but they don't teach anyone anything. So I hope that today we're going to have a nuanced conversation about body image, and really the first thing to acknowledge if we're going to have a conversation about beauty standards is that beauty does not exist. It's a social construct. There's only one thing that all human beings find attractive, and that's facial symmetry. They've done tests on babies, and babies respond better to human beings with symmetrical faces than non-symmetrical faces. But everything else we think about what it means to have a good body, we have learned. We learn it from our environment and from our culture. And if you want proof that that's true, you only have to look at the way that beauty standards change depending on where you are in the world. I remember I learned this the first time I was invited to the Far East. I went to a school in Shanghai, and like most Westerners traveling to that side of the world, first thing that happened to me, tummy bug. So I went into Boots to get some medicine, and I saw shelves and shelves of moisturizers with skin lightening agents in them. And this is not skin bleaching. This is not that very painful, illegal, under-the-counter thing that tends to happen more in South Asia. This is Boots. Where we would have rows and rows of moisturizers with a hint of self-tan, they have rows and rows of moisturizers with skin lightening agents in them. And I remember looking at them for ages thinking, this is so alien to everything that I understand. And of course, there are reasons why that beauty standard exists over in that area of the world that have to do with colonialism and imperialism, but the main reason is that it's easier to get a tan in Shanghai. In Britain, unless you happen to be naturally blessed with a darker skin tone, really hard to get a tan. That's why we lose our minds when the sun shines. We're like, quick, where's the barbecue? Where's the Pims? Take your top off, because we don't know when it's going to happen again. And the number one rule of all beauty standards is that it has to be difficult for people who live in that part of the world to attain, because that keeps people apologetic, keeps people thinking that they're flawed. Which is why in areas of the world where food is scarce, it's considered beautiful to be fat. In areas of the world where food is abundant, it's considered beautiful to be thin, because it's harder. The second rule of beauty standards is that they must change over time. The goalpost must always move. People must never allow to be satisfied with themselves. So what you're seeing on the screen are 3 male beauty standards. In the 1800s, on the left, that was a hot guy. That's what men thought that they were supposed to look like. 1970s, David Bowie, sex symbol, not one muscle in his whole body. And then what you're seeing on the right-hand side is a cover from Men's Health magazine in 2023. And it's this very muscular shape that young men are now being told that they're supposed to aspire to. Now, what's interesting about that is I work with a charity called Men Get Eating Disorders Too, and what their research shows is that, on average, this is not universally applicable, but on average, girls and boys tend to enter eating disorders from opposite ends. So with girls and women, they tend to restrict food first, and then because bodies are clever and they know when they're being starved, their weight plateaus. So then they think, I've got to try and find another way of losing weight, and then the compulsive exercise behaviours begin, and that's how the eating disorder develops. With boys and men, it usually begins with an obsession with muscle building. And then when they're in online forums, or even sometimes when they're in the gym, they start to pick up really unhelpful ideas about quote-unquote nutrition, and they start to restrict their food, and that's how it develops. And then both of them meet in the middle, in exactly the same place, where they're exercising compulsively and being incredibly restrictive around what they consume. Ultimately, this is all about the space between who a person wishes they were and who they actually are. And the greater the space between these two people, the more money can be made out of them. But the greater the space between these two people, the lower your self-esteem will be. So ultimately, we're living in a culture which is lowering our self-esteem every single day, because it's telling us that we are imperfect and that we need to fix ourselves. And that's what I'm trying to make young people vigilant against. And let me be clear, this is a real fundamental core belief of mine. It's something that my mum said to me when I was very young, and I never forgot it. She said, your body is the only thing you'll ever have in your whole life that you truly own. And I really believe that everybody's body is theirs and they own it, and it's up to them what they do with it, and it's really no one else's business. We'll discuss this later, but it's not what we do, but why we do it. That is important. And I just want to get young people thinking about the choices that they're making and what they mean. The problem with body image extends way beyond what they see when they look in the mirror. There are so many different studies. I've chosen Girl Guiding, but there's an organisation called Happy Body Org that's also done a lot of research into this, that young people avoid everyday school activities because of concerns about how they look. And if you think about that first statistic there, 14 is around about the time when you're thinking about your GCSEs. Those girls aren't going to pick the subjects that they've been avoiding, so their relationship with their body will affect the subjects that they study and therefore the qualifications that they get and therefore the jobs that they can apply for, their whole career path, potentially. 45% of men will experience bigorexia. It's a stupid made-up media word. It just means an obsession with muscle building at some point during their life. Girls as young as 7 feel that society judges them more on their looks than on their ability. And that's significant because 7, for children who are developing along the ordinary pathway, is around about the time that you start to get what's called critical faculty. So you know how kids under the age of 7, they just say why, forever until you want to scream. That's because they're absorbing the world like a sponge. But around about the age of 7, you start to be choosy. You go, well, this person told me this thing, but this person told me that thing, but they're probably more trustworthy than them, so I'm going to believe them. And you start to make decisions about how you take in information. So if a 7-year-old tells you something, they're like a mirror. They're holding up a mirror to the environment that they find themselves in because they've just been absorbing it like a sponge. So we should believe 7-year-olds when they tell them that this is what society looks like. And then 1 in 8 adults, and this was pre-pandemic, so I would guess that it's probably got worse since then, has experienced suicidal thoughts because of concerns about body image. It's also part of this issue of perfectionism. One of the experts I work with is a guy called Dr. Thomas Curran. He's currently at the LSE, but he used to work at Bath Uni, and while he was there, he authored this groundbreaking study into perfectionism in Gen Z. And what his study showed was that with each passing generation, perfectionism is getting worse. And when we say perfectionist, colloquially, what we mean is, well, this is a person who tries really hard at everything they do. That's actually not what a perfectionist is. A perfectionist is somebody who overworks in those areas of their life where they feel most confident. They go above and beyond. But they self-sabotage in those areas of their life where they feel least confident, because they would rather not try than try and fail. The thing about perfectionists is they have an overwhelming fear of failure. And Tom told me about an experiment that they did where they brought together a group of test subjects, half of whom scored really high on a perfectionism test, the other half did not. They measured their fitness individually and assessed how far they should be able to comfortably run in 5 minutes. And they gave them all an individual target, but it was a comfortable run. They wouldn't have had to have exerted themselves too much. They then put them on a treadmill. They ran for 5 minutes, and then regardless of how far they ran, they were told that they had failed and that they had to go again. The half of the group who didn't score highly on a perfectionism test had the logical response to that scenario. They went, oh, okay, well, I've been told I should be able to do this, so obviously it's a reflection of my effort. So most of them tried harder the second time and ran faster the second time. The group that scored highly on a perfectionism test pretty much walked it the second time, because they would rather not try than run the risk of a second failure. So if you have a child who often procrastinates, doesn't study for tests, leaves their homework until the last minute, the chances are they're not lazy. The chances are they're just not confident in that area of their study, and it's an act of self-sabotage. This is 3 questions that I came up with in collaboration with Thomas Curran. And what I usually do is I get the audience of young people to close their eyes so they can't see each other. And then I ask them how much they agree with each of these 3 statements on a scale of 1 to 7. And if it's more than 4, I invite them to raise their hand. That first one, other people's expectations of me are more important than my opinion of myself. Normally about a third will raise their hand for that. Nothing I ever do feels like it's good enough. Usually about half will raise their hand. And then I avoid activities I suspect I won't be good at because I fear failure. That's the one that gets them. About 2/3 on average will raise their hand for that statement. You can see how that might affect their academic performance, but Body image is part of this because the two things that young people are told they have the power to control are their grades and how they look. So if they have perfectionist tendencies, if they have anxiety, they're going to pour that energy into trying to manipulate those two outcomes disproportionately. The solution, I think, is very well summed up in this quote. One of my favourite academics ever, I love her. I went to go and see a lecture she did once, and I remember walking out and thinking, the world looks different. This woman has changed my perspective. I feel like a different person. And she made a documentary, Dr. Jean Kilbourne, called Killing Us Softly. And it's about the relationship between the way that women's bodies are objectified in media and advertising and violence against women. And this is a quote from that documentary. But the reason I like it so much is because if you take the two challenges that she's presenting us with here, the first step is to become aware, to pay attention. And the second is to change the environment. I think you can take that and apply it to pretty much any social problem, and it works. You need to properly become aware, understand how is this showing up in my life, what does it look like, and then work to change the environment. Now, the advantage of being a digital citizen is that you do have the power to change your environment to an extent. And you all remember growing up without social media. I know I do. And the only role models we had available to us had been chosen for us because they were on TV or they were in magazines or we knew them in real life. And that could be quite an isolating experience. I know it was for me. I grew up in a tiny village in Essex called Ugly. You can look it up. We are most famous for having an ugly women's institute. There's another village down the road called Nasty as well, and there was a headline in the local paper once that said, "Ugly woman marries nasty man." None of this is relevant, I'm just telling you, to tell you. But that village was 99% populated by Caucasian white people, and the 1% that weren't was my dad. We were the only multiracial family for miles. I also am bisexual. I went to school during Section 28 when teachers weren't allowed to mention queerness in the classroom. I remember I was 17 and we were discussing The Merchant of Venice. I had this fabulous English teacher called Dr. Cochrane, who was an incredible man with amazing eyebrows. And he said once, just offhand, he went, of course, Bassanio is in love with Antonio and Portia because he's bisexual, as many intelligent people are. And I remember thinking, there's a word for it. There's a word for it. I didn't know that there were other people like me up until I was 17 years old, and that was an incredibly isolating experience. I'm also really tall. And I'm not a sort of willowy, elegant tall person either. I'm a tall person that takes up space, so I always feel really conspicuous wherever I go. So for all of those reasons, I felt like I was on the periphery of things. I was kind of on the outside looking in, and I didn't have a tribe, and I didn't fit in. And so in many ways, I wish I'd had social media, because I think it could have connected me to other people who were like me. You have to use it in a smart way, but there is an opportunity there to see yourself as the curator of your environment. And we need to acknowledge that, I think, because social media is not going anywhere. So you can demonize it if you want to, but I don't think we're getting that genie back in the bottle. In terms of becoming aware, it's very useful, I think, to think of the brain like an iceberg. Part above the surface is the conscious mind, the part we're aware of and in control of. The part below the surface is the unconscious. And the unconscious has evolved to respond to repetition. So anything that we do say, hear, experience over and over and over again eventually becomes unconscious. Great talking to people your age because I can use the example of driving. You know when you first learn to drive and you think, how does anyone do this? And it's not that any one component of driving is particularly hard, it's just that it's doing it all at once. After you've been driving for a while, not only does the act of driving become automatic, but so do certain journeys. You drive from home to work and you go, that's weird, I've got no memory of that journey at all. And that's because you've done it so many times and your brain has absorbed it into the unconscious because that's where all the storage space is. That frees up your conscious to deal with the unique challenges of your day. And most of the time this works gloriously to our advantage. The way it can work to our disadvantage is it means that we can take on beliefs, ideas, ways of seeing things, not because they're true necessarily, but just because they've been repeated to us. And that's what a stereotype is. It's something we've heard so often, we think it must be true. And then confirmation bias comes into play. So we think, oh, there's truth in this stereotype because every time I experience it or see it, I notice it disproportionately. What this ultimately means is that we've got this symbiotic relationship with our environment where we're absorbing ideas from our environment, but also looking to the environment for proof that those ideas are true. And that makes our environment incredibly important. Now, one of the ideas that we pick up, I believe, from our environment is a gendered shame trigger. You may be familiar with the psychologist Brené Brown. She talks about this a lot. And this is always on average. So you might not relate to this, your child might not relate to this, but on average, I think this holds up. The average woman has a pretty straightforward shame trigger around beauty. If you want to shame a woman, call her ugly, you're pretty much done. I saw this recently myself. So before I got my show on LBC, I had what I would describe as the perfect level of fame. Insofar as within education and mental health, if you imagine it like a Venn diagram, here's education, here's mental health. Where those two things overlap, I was Beyonce. I could go to an education and mental health conference. I couldn't walk from one end of the room to the other without people asking me to sign things and get selfies, and it was great. And then I would leave that conference and I would go out onto the street and have total anonymity. It's fantastic. I didn't appreciate it at the time, and I really should have done. And then I got this job at LBC, and it introduced me to a completely different audience. And LBC announced my show with a picture of me on their Facebook page. Now, I'm not on Facebook, but my dad is. So he sent me the link, and he was like, I don't think I'm happy about this. So I'm looking at this link, and there's all these men talking about how, I'm paraphrasing, but how they quite like to have sex with me. So I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, what? Why? Why is that their initial response? So I said to Dad, stop looking at it, don't worry about it. And then I started broadcasting, and these guys very quickly worked out that my opinions are far too progressive for their taste. Exactly the same guys returned to my photo on Facebook. They're now talking about how hideously unattractive they find me, how they would never want to have sex with me. And I'm watching this unfold thinking, at what point did these men think that sex with me was an option? It was never on the table, Nigel. What are you talking about? And then I realized something. I realized that they're trying to silence me. So they've learned that you shame a woman into silence by making her feel undesirable. That's something they've learned from the culture that they exist in. So what they've actually done is they've gone, I don't like what this woman, she's making me think. She's making me think differently about things. I need her to shut up. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and shame her into silence by drawing attention to what I perceive to be her flaws. And after that happened, I noticed it all the time. High-profile women, regardless of how they look, you will always see this happening to them, the way that they are approached on social media. For your average man, the shame trigger relates to strength. If you want to shame a man, you call him weak. So this got me thinking, because I thought, you probably could change this, but it would take ages, and I'm quite a pragmatic person. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you can't change this, that these are set in stone. You can't change the shame trigger, you can change the definition of the words. So for example, beauty. The definition of beauty is fluid. And we've seen body positivity campaigners over recent years working really hard to diversify what it means to be beautiful. And that, I think, must be helpful for women's mental health. Equally, I think you can diversify or change the definition of strength. Because somewhere along the line, boys are learning that to be strong is to be stoic. That strong people never talk about how they feel, they never ask for help. That's not only unhelpful, it's unrealistic. We're pack animals. We literally evolved in tribes. So none of us are perfect. We're going to have to ask for help at some point in our life. We have evolved to rely on one another, which is why there's this epidemic of loneliness in our individualistic society, because we actually need to be together in order to survive. So I wonder whether the solution then is to change the definition of strength and say, well, it's really strong to show vulnerability. It's really strong to talk about how you feel. It's strong to support your friends when they are feeling low. And celebrating role models who do that. I was so disappointed in the way that the newspapers treated Prince Harry when he was talking about his trauma and getting therapy. and the way that they demonized him for that, because there was a real opportunity there to go, wow, look at this enlightened, self-aware, strong man who can be a role model for how you deal with historic trauma. That, I think, is going to be a big part in helping boys and young men have a more helpful definition of strength to aspire to. One of the things that is very unhelpful, I think, particularly in terms of strength, is health influencers. You've seen these people. They're on TikTok, they're on Instagram, they're everywhere. And what they do is they say, if you eat like me, or you exercise like me, you too can be as popular and as wealthy and as successful and as attractive as I appear to be in the content that I'm putting out on social media. The problem is, a lot of them don't have the qualifications to be giving that message. Many of them are sponsored by companies who have a vested interest in them pushing a certain product or a service. And to give you an example of this, recently there was a spate of health influencers who were claiming that celery juice cures depression. And the reason that they were claiming that was because of either a willful or unwillful, I don't know, but a real lack of scientific literacy, because you can find a study on the internet, has a sample size of 15 people. And what it shows is that those who drink celery juice are less likely to exhibit symptoms of depression than those who don't. It's a very good example of correlation. Or there could be a triangulating factor there somewhere. You know, people who drink celery juice could be wealthier, or they could live in a sunnier climate. You know, you don't know. But again, and this did not work in this school, but to demonstrate that, what I do is I say, put your hand up if you live in a house with an even number on the door. Now, a lot of your children live in houses that don't have a number on the door, so it didn't work. But in other schools, half the kids will raise their hand because that's how numbers work. Now, statistically, the children with their hand up are more likely to do well in their GCSEs. Statistically, that's absolutely true, because if you take any group and you divide them by an arbitrary metric, one will always do slightly better than the other, even if it's by 0.5%. But that doesn't mean that one caused the other. Obviously, we don't advocate that children approaching their GCSEs move into a house with an odd number on the door in order to perform better in their exams. So teaching young people that kind of scientific literacy, okay, is this correlation or is this causation? Because the only thing that celery juice can do for you is make you slightly more hydrated, in a slightly disgusting way, actually, because celery's fine, but celery juice is not the one. So, with the health influencers, I also give them people that I think they should follow. Pixie Turner used to be one of these health influencers, or she calls them wellness wankers. And then she had a revelation one day that they were manipulating vulnerable people. So she went off and she got herself a degree and a master's in nutrition. She's currently studying for her PhD. And she now dedicates herself to debunking some of the myths that are put out there about nutrition. There's also another guy who's not up there, but I did recommend to your children, called Ben Carpenter, who does similar with exercise. So he takes videos from fitness influencers and actually examines what are they saying and what's the science behind that in a really balanced way. He is a personal trainer, so he believes in exercise. He believes it's great for physical health and mental health, which it is, but he's sensible about it, which I think is what young people need. Another thing that I think we need to be very careful about is calorie-controlled diets. Now, it's obviously really important to eat as healthily as you can, given what you have access to. But as soon as calories enter the chat, there's a problem, because for weight loss, calorie-controlled diets have a 97% failure rate. That means in 97% of cases, you may lose weight in the short term, but you will regain it and probably a little bit more on top of it as well. There's a 1 in 5 chance, if you embark on a strict calorie-controlled diet, that you will go on to develop an eating disorder, which means that statistically your chances of developing an eating disorder are higher than your chances of losing weight and keeping it off long term. My best friend, for full disclosure, Sharu Izadi, is the UK's leading expert on habit change. She used to work in the NHS in addiction services, and she watched, while she was there, people who were addicted mainly to heroin and crack, and she looked at the difference between those who were successful in overhauling their addiction and their habits long term and those who kept coming back. And then based on those observations, she came up with this thing called the kindness method, which is all about how you overhaul a habit successfully. It's a brilliant book, I recommend it. And not just because she's my best mate, it is genuinely good. But she also applied it to herself, because Sharu used to be much, much larger than that picture you see of her there. And like many women and some men too, she was caught in this cycle of oscillating. So she was gaining a lot of weight and then going on a crash diet and losing it very fast, and then gaining it again and losing it, which is terrible for you, by the way. It's actually healthier to be consistently a little bit overweight than to keep gaining and re-losing the same chunk of weight. And then one day she was the heaviest she had ever been and the most unhappy with her body that she'd ever been. And she went to see a new therapist. And the therapist said to her, okay, this body that you have right now, I want you to imagine that it can't change, that this is it forever. How would your life change? And Sharu thought about it, and she realized that was such a clever question, because she had been putting her life on hold, and so many of us do this. We think we don't deserve certain things unless we look a certain way. So she was not exercising, because she didn't know that exercise could be a thing you do for pleasure. She was too ashamed of her body, so she wasn't exercising. She wasn't saying yes to social invitations because she felt too self-conscious. She told me this thing that made me so sad. She said she wouldn't even listen to her favorite tracks, her music tracks. She wouldn't listen to her favorite songs because she didn't want to associate the joy of that music with feeling so terrible about her body. So what this therapist was actually saying to her was, live as though you have already attained your ideal weight and see what happens. So she did. She started moving for joy. She calls it deliberate movement rather than exercise, which I love. She started moving for joy. She started saying yes to social invitations. She started eating what she calls the in-betweeny foods, which is not 10 pizzas because she's on a binge, but it's not 2 rice cakes because she's on a crash diet. She started listening to her body, tuning into her hunger signals. And of course, her body evened out where it was supposed to be, which is not the thinnest she's ever been. It's not the largest she's ever been either. We've got it the wrong way around, I think. We have it in our heads that certain weights and certain sizes are inherently healthy, and it doesn't matter how you get there. I think what we should be telling young people is treat your body as kindly as you can, and then see how it ends up. And however it ends up is how it's supposed to be. And it'll be different from your sister or your brother or your mom or your next door neighbor, because we're all built differently, but that's you, that's your body. Body positivity, I think, is a bit of a misnomer, because it's not about loving your body. I think the whole idea that you should love yourself is really unrealistic, particularly if you're British. Like, I changed my mindfulness mantras to make them more British. So instead of saying I am magnificent, I just go, I'm all right. Loving yourself, I don't think is a realistic aim. I think it's about respecting your body. I think that's what we should be aiming for, respecting your body. And if you respect your body, then it will end up as it is supposed to be. Sorry, I should have warned you the bums were coming up. Back in 2017, I filmed a show called Naked Beach. I was not naked at any point. You're all trying to work out which one is my bum. I was the presenter of the show alongside a guy called Professor Keon West. And Professor Keon had done some research which showed that if you have very low body image satisfaction, but not a diagnosable eating disorder, so for example, if your lack of body image satisfaction was stopping you from having a relationship or living your life as you would like to, but you don't have an eating disorder, you don't have body dysmorphia. If you spend time around a diverse range of naked people, it will improve the way that you feel about your body. That's what his research showed. So we wanted to test if this was true. We sent some people who had low body image satisfaction to a Greek island to live with 8 naked body positivity campaigners for 2 weeks. And then using a scale that Professor Keon had come up with, we measured their life satisfaction, body image satisfaction, and self-esteem at the beginning and at the end of the week. One of the guys was this guy, Daryl. And Daryl, very sporty, really into sport, big part of his life. And then, like most people who are sporty, got an injury, and it was a knee injury. And I've had a knee injury. I don't know about any of you, but they're so frustrating, because if you don't need surgery, the solution to a knee injury is you've just got to sit there until it heals. So if you're used to being very active, you go from being very active to completely sedentary overnight. And if exercise is your coping strategy for stress and a big part of how you live your life, you will feel like a bumblebee in a jar. You'll think, I've got all this energy and it has nowhere to go. And that's what happened to Daryl, and he started to cope with how he was feeling, and he gained a lot of weight in a very short period of time. His knee healed, but his self-esteem didn't. And he really wanted in some ways to start exercising again and doing sport again, but I think he was self-conscious about how his body looked. But it was also because, like most sporty people, he's a really competitive person, and he knew he wouldn't be quite as fast or quite as strong because he'd been out of the game for a while, and that frightened him. Now, part of my job was to design the activities that the contributors would do on the island with the positivity campaigners. So what I got Daryl doing was stuff that was fun and active, but it didn't matter. So, you know, like when you're in primary school and you do an egg and spoon race, or wheelbarrow race, that was an interesting one, naked. So picking up each other's legs and running with them, or tying their legs together and hopping along. Just to remind him that it's really fun to do physical activity, and it's not always about personal best, and to try and sort of help him to break through that and slowly build his relationship with exercise. It has to start from a place of respecting your body, and it has to start from a place of non-self-punishment. That's how you embed a sustainable habit. And again, Sharu talks about this, that we often have this mindset of, as of Monday, I don't know why it's always Monday, but as of Monday, my whole life will change. I'm going to get up at 4 a.m, I'm going to drink 2 litres of water, I'm going to meditate, I'm going to go to the gym. This is all before I even get to work. And then we maybe do that for 2 days, and then it's not sustainable. The way that you embed lifelong habits is to do it gradually. And that's the approach that we took with Daryl. So some key principles for you to take away with you. First of all, positive body image is central to, not at odds with, physical health. Again, the media loves to polarize, so it will go, oh yeah, body positivity is important, but what about the obesity crisis? People who respect their bodies naturally make healthier choices, and there is a ton of evidence that you can find that will back that up. You can't tell how healthy someone is by looking. There are 100 or more unique contributory factors which determine an individual's weight. They have to do with their genes, their hormones, their medical history, their environment, their psychology, and their lifestyle. That's definitely part of it, but for some reason we only ever focus on the lifestyle bit, and we think that we can tell what choices a person is making simply by looking at them. I wouldn't do this because it would be unethical, but if I got 2 people and put them in a cage, and I fed them exactly the same diet, and I made them do exactly the same amount of exercise, they would still end up 2 different weights because they're built different. And that's how human beings are. Treat your body kindly and it will look as it is supposed to. And then finally, it's not what we do with our bodies, but why that is important. And this is something that I touched upon earlier. When I tell people that I talk about body image, I get some quite strange responses sometimes. One of which is, so why have you had your lips done then? Now, the thing to understand about that is that I haven't. My face has always looked like this. And when I was at school, it was not fashionable to have big lips. I used to be teased for pouting. And when I raised my hand in class to ask a question, I used to ask it like this. Because it wasn't enough to stop me talking, because I'm me. But it was enough to make me self-conscious enough that I used to ask the question like this, because I was really self-conscious about my mouth and how it looked. Now, I will literally be walking down the street, and grown-ass women will come up to me and they will say, where did you get your lips done? And I have to say, very exclusive clinic called my mother's womb. So it just goes to show you, I think, that if you're yourself, eventually you will come into fashion, because we know that fashions and beauty standards change. But it does make me think, when I get asked that question, it makes me think, what if I had though? What if I had? Does it make what I'm saying any less true? Does it make my motivations any less pure? It's my body, it's my face, and it's up to me what I do with it. And I think, particularly women, we spend far too much time judging each other's choices. Like, you can zoom out and you can look at the trends and you can say, what does this say about the society that we live in? But what I don't think is appropriate is to point at another person and laugh at them or ridicule them or judge them for the choices that they make with their body, because ultimately it's their body. It's not what we do, but why we do it that is important. So with that in mind, I've encouraged your children to find people who they think are good role models online. One of the things that struck me about Naked Beach and working on that show, we filmed it in the summer of 2017. It aired on Channel 4 in the summer of 2018. So there was a whole year between when we filmed it and when it went to air. And then when a show is broadcast, you have to do publicity around it. So I was meeting the contributors a year afterwards, and the impact had lasted. And part of the reason for that, they told me, was that when they came off the island, they followed the body positivity campaigners on social media, and the algorithm got involved and went, oh, okay, you like body positivity, I'm going to give you more accounts like that. And then suddenly their social media silo is populated by people who are reinforcing what they've learned on the island. And that to me shows how powerful it can be to have the right messages that you're absorbing unconsciously from your online environment. So these are just 3 people that I follow. Jamie Windus, non-binary campaigner. They remind me that fashion beauty is supposed to be fun and creative. Like, this is not a look based on fitting in, is it? And they remind me that, you know, it's okay to be different, and that it's not about, oh, I can't leave the house unless I look a certain way. It's about having fun and being creative with your body, if you choose to. Equally, you may not choose to. Megan Jane Crabb is my favourite body positivity campaigner. She has more than 1 million followers on Instagram alone, and she takes that responsibility so seriously. She consults with doctors and scientists. She's written a book which is so well researched that the glossary is like almost thicker than the book. And she's giving health advice, or she's talking about some of the things that I've touched on in this talk, but she takes her responsibility to her 1 million followers seriously, and I think more influencers should be like that. And then the one-armed wonder, Dan Richards, he used to be in the army, and then he was involved in a motorbike accident, and he lost one of his arms and part of one of his shoulders, and became disabled as a result. And what Dan reminds me of is to not stay in my comfort zone. So remember earlier I was talking to you about perfectionism. Ever since Dan recovered, and I think it is because he nearly died, he really understands the value of life. So any opportunity that comes his way, he'll just grab it. And I feel like every time I look at him, he's trying something different. And it's really random as well. And you think, well, no, I'm good at all of these things. No, he's trained to fly a light aircraft. He's trained to be a scuba instructor. He's done a marathon. He does bike challenges. He's done a TED talk. He's run a runway as a model. He's been to Parliament and advocated for people with disabilities. And he reminds me that fully living is running the risk that you might fail. And that's important to me. So these are the types of people that I mean when I say we should all be thinking about, why am I on social media? What am I looking to get out of this experience? And finding people who fulfill those needs. If you, and I will send this across to you, but if you scan this QR code, it will take you through to the resources page of my website. And on there's an activity sheet that talks you through this curation process. So it's something that you can do at home, where you both look at your social media feed, you and your child, you look at what's toxic and not serving you, you find ways to get rid of that, and then you populate it with things that do serve you and help you to be the sort of person that you want to be. Doing that is part of a process called digital self-care. I did not invent the term digital self-care. It was invented by Olashey Akiwowo, and she founded a charity called Glitch, who I'm now an ambassador for. And Glitch do 2 things. The first thing is they advocate for marginalised voices online. So you know how the internet and social media got invented and everyone started going, free speech, my right to free speech is so important. And free speech is really important. It's a really important right. But so is the freedom not to be harassed. And in a civilized society, those 2 rights have to coexist side by side. And what's happening at the moment, you've got people like Elon Musk saying Twitter should be a global marketplace of ideas. And it absolutely should be. He's right, that's what it should be, but it's not. Because marginalised voices are having their contributions bullied out of the conversation. And that is particularly true of black women. And Glitch have done a lot of research around this about you're about 80 times more likely to experience abuse online if you're a black woman than if you are not a black woman. So they advocate for marginalised voices. They also teach digital citizenship. And there are lots of resources on their website about how to do that, how to make sure you're not seeing what you don't want to see and you are seeing more of what you want to see online. The last tip that I will leave you with is it's not just images that contribute to our unconscious thinking, it's also words. The words that we use are super important. When I'm working in primary schools, I very often do this activity where I'll divide the board in half and I'll say to the kids, tell me the last compliment you heard a grown-up paying another grown-up. And they're always like, oh, your hair looks nice, you look well, you've lost weight, I like your bag, I like your shoes. And it's all to do with how people look and what they have. So we write that down on one side of the board. Then I say to them, think of your favourite person in the world and try to sum up for me in 1 or 2 words why you like them. Why do you like that person? And they'll say, well, they're kind, or they're brave, or they're a good listener, or they're fun, or they're weird and they get me, or I enjoy spending time with them. And we write that down on the other side of the board, and you start to build up this picture that the reason that we are valued and the reasons that we're told we're valued are very, very different. And we learn through repetition. So if you exist in an environment where people are always going, your shoes, your shoes, your shoes, your shoes. But actually the reason that you're valued is because you're kind. You're never going to learn that. You're going to think the most important thing about you is your shoes. Now we don't lie to kids. You know, things like your grades do affect your experience of life. The way that you look does affect your experience of life, but neither of those things are the most important thing about them. And I think in order to run the risk that they may fail and to get over these perfectionist tendencies, they have to understand that it's these intangible qualities that they're bringing to the table. So I would encourage you all, and again, if you're British, this is hard, but it gets easier the more you practice, to do a compliment swap in your homes and to start saying things like, I really enjoyed spending time with you today, or well done, that was really kind. And my best tip for parents is, pay your child a compliment when you know that they can hear you, but they don't know that you know that they can hear you. So if you're talking to someone else, if you're on the phone, for example, and they're around the corner, and you can be like, oh, I'm so proud of my daughter because she's so brave, or whatever it is. And that will hit home more. It takes away the kind of, you have to say that because you're my dad thing that they always say. On my website there is a page called Advice and Support, and you will find about 20 different charities on there that offer confidential support and evidence-based information on mental health. For body image issues, if you're worried about eating disorders in particular, BEAT is a great resource. Young Minds is the only charity that I'm aware of that has a parent helpline. So if your child is struggling with their mental health and you would like some support either for yourself or in managing their behaviour, they have a helpline that you can call. I would also really recommend that you download to your phone an app called the Hub of Hope. The Hub of Hope is Tinder for your mental health. I know the guy that founded this, and I keep telling him to make that a strapline, but he won't, and it's annoying. But you type in your postcode, and it generates a list of all of the mental health support available in your area, and it tells you how far away you are from it. That is Tinder for your mental health. And it's based on the idea that if you're struggling with your mental health, you will go to your GP, because that's what most people do. But depending on waiting times in your area, resources, how acute your mental health issue is deemed to be, you'll be put on a waiting list. That waiting list is 2 weeks if you're extremely lucky, and 2 years if you're really not. And the Hub of Hope is there to help people understand what's available whilst they're waiting. Outside of the NHS, but it's all met a quality assurance. So it's a really useful thing to have on your phone, because you never know when you might need it. Also on my website there is a page called Books. You can download my recommended reading list, and there is a section for parents on there. I've also written some books, and there is absolutely no obligation to buy them, but it's really helpful for my career if you do. I've written a book called Clicks, How to Be Your Best Self Online. A lot of what I've talked about today is in there, but it's based on, a lot of young people were saying, social media is being demonized, and I'm being told not to go on it, and I'll definitely be radicalized, and I'll definitely be groomed, and I'll send a naked selfie, and it'll stay on the internet forever, and I'll never be able to find a job, and I'll die in a ditch. And that is unhelpful, because I feel like I have to be online, and I want to learn how to navigate this world. And so this is a kind of really granular guide. What do you do? If you're being piled on, what do you do? If you think you're being radicalized, what do you do? And I interviewed some really top experts in the field as well. Yes, you can ace school without losing your mind. You don't have to choose between your mental health and your academic performance. In fact, one complements the other, because it's all your brain. So this is filled with study skills that support mental health, and there's quizzes in there as well, so they can find out what type of learner they are and when they're most productive and stuff like that. And then I also write YA novels for 13 to 18-year-olds, one of which is called Toxic, and it's about 2 sixth form girls that become platonically infatuated. You know, when you're a teenager, you have these really intense friendships, and they kind of fall in love platonically, but the friendship very quickly becomes, as the title would suggest, toxic. And it's not about what to do or what happens when the person that's coercively controlling you is not a romantic partner, when it's your best friend. So yeah, there's that as well. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope that you found it useful and interesting. Does anybody have a question that they would like to ask? Yeah.
Just quickly, will we get a copy of this presentation?
I can send the slides through.
Really
That's fine.
love that.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? I was really intrigued when you were saying that 2/3 of the kids knew that they were self-sabotaging.
Yeah.
I'm quite surprised by that. Do you think they do that as a conscious decision, or do you think it's subconscious?
I think sometimes you have to point it out to them, so you can see them going, oh yeah, before they raise their hand. I think they know they avoid things if they think they won't be good at them. What they're less likely to know is that's the reason that they're putting their homework off, or that's the reason that they're not studying for a test. Sometimes that needs to be pointed out to them, but it's an unconscious process.
I think the first thing, if we have young kids, to tell them, the mindset about everything. So I come from the house. I live in the house with no number. With a numbers. I wish no number. I could put my name on it, but it's not the issue. So I told my children, fortunately, they come here. 2 of them came here to the school because of the brand. I tell them, you are going to see people. It's different.
Yeah.
They are mixed race as well. So I told them the most important thing in your mindset, why you come here, and then we all the same. It's not about where you're coming from. It's about here and here.
Yeah.
That's the best thing. And the mindset about whole thing. The subject is very good. I learned many things.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and
I really
also,
appreciate that.
although I translate in my brain,
Yeah.
yeah, I really focus on what you say. It's very interesting. So that's the idea for me, to tell my children to have the mindset how we can cope with everything,
Yeah.
and then here as well, to fight.
Yeah.
That's my idea.
Yeah.
You don't mention about mindset, but the whole thing cover, isn't it?
I think that's a really good message to give them, and it reminds me actually, Professor Keon West, he has 2 areas of expertise. One is body image, but the other is racism. And I remember I said to him once, I was like, well, if there was no racism, we would never have to think about race. And he was like, I know why you're saying that, but he said, I think if there was no racism, what we would do is we would celebrate and be curious about difference. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, that it's okay to notice that other people are different from you, but you can be curious about that and celebrate that without thinking that they are less than you in any way.
It's one of the reasons actually we're working really hard with the school values. So the school values are, that Rugbyans are kind, authentic, grounded, curious, those sort of things. Actually, sort of really trying to be celebrating them and for the characteristics that they have, rather than what they look like or what their achievements are. I mean, achievements sort of plays into it, but actually about what kind of people they want to be and who they are actually. Yeah.
You two can work it out between yourselves.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to challenge one. At the beginning, you talked about doctors, and I've been a GP for 15 years now. I did female anatomy in the 90s. I don't know a doctor that hasn't done female anatomy. And I've never called anyone a witch. I do an awful lot of female work, and I know there's a gross generalisation, but there's an awful lot of doctor back